The wind had scoured the land clean, leaving behind a silence as sharp and brittle as the frozen stalks of prairie grass that poked through the thin crust of snow. Late winter in the Wyoming Territory was not a time of quiet rest, but of waiting. The world held its breath, caught between the brutal memory of the last blizzard and the distant, unbelievable promise of a thaw. It was a hollow, hungry season, and the emptiness of the plains mirrored the one Silas Kane carried inside him. He rode with his collar turned up against a cold that had no mercy, the leather of his saddle creaking in a steady rhythm that was the only sound for miles. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, blew plumes of steam that vanished almost instantly in the frigid air. The town of Dagger Rock was a full day's ride behind him, and the meager supplies in his saddlebags, flour, salt, coffee, and a small sack of beans, felt like a poor defense against the vastness surrounding him. But it was enough. It had been enough for 3 years. Silas kept his eyes on the trail, a faint ribbon of churned mud and ice winding through the gray-brown expanse. He was a man who noticed things. The way a hawk circled on a thermal he could not feel. The precise track of a coyote that had crossed the path hours before. The subtle shift in the clouds that spoke of more snow to come. His life had been whittled down to these small, hard truths. And he preferred it that way. The world of men, with its loud talk and easy lies, was a place he visited only when necessity demanded. His ranch, nestled in a small valley shielded by a line of stubborn mesas, was his sanctuary, his penance. It was this habit of observation that made him pull Gideon to a halt. Something was wrong. Not a predator's track or a change in the weather, but a disturbance in the landscape itself. A splash of white against the dirty snow in the ditch alongside the trail, crumpled and out of place, like a piece of paper dropped by a careless traveler. But it was too large for paper. He dismounted, the cold seeping instantly through the worn soles of his boots. Every muscle in him was tight with caution. The West did not offer up gentle surprises. He moved slowly, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself, and the cold in his gut deepened to a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. It was a woman, or what was left of one. She was lying face down, half buried in a drift of snow that had been swept into the ditch. The white he had seen was the fabric of a dress, a wedding dress. He realized with a jolt. The fine material was ripped to shreds, its lace hem caked with frozen mud and stiff with ice. One of her shoulders was bare, the skin a frightening, waxy white. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was fanned out and tangled with bits of dead grass. She was entirely still. Silas knelt, his knee cracking in the frozen silence. He reached out a gloved hand and gently turned her over. A small, broken sound escaped his lips. Her face was gaunt, her skin tinged with a delicate, porcelain blue that spoke of a cold that had settled deep in her bones. Her lips were the color of faded violets. A dark bruise bloomed across one cheekbone, stark against the pallor of her skin. But she was young, younger than he would have guessed. And her feet, dear God, her feet were bare, raw and bloodless, nestled in the snow as if she had simply given up walking and laid down to die. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, under the line of her jaw, expecting to find nothing but cold, unresponsive flesh. For a long second, there was nothing. Then, he felt it. A flutter, a thread of a pulse so faint and fragile it felt more like a memory than a sign of life. It was a life he did not want. His own was a heavy enough burden. The cabin was his. The silence was his. The ghosts were his. There was no room for another soul, especially one so clearly chased by a world of trouble. He should ride on, find the sheriff in Dagger Rock, tell him what he found. That was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But he looked at her face, at the way her eyelashes lay like tiny, frozen feathers against her bruised cheek, and he saw another face, another woman lost to the cruelty of the world. He saw his Sarah, The thought was a knife twist in his heart, sharp and familiar. He could not leave her. He could not. With a groan that was part effort and part despair, Silas gathered her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of cold bones and ruined silk. He carried her to Gideon, who shifted nervously, his eyes wide as he scented the strangeness of the burden. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, his voice a rough rasp. "Easy now." He managed to swing himself into the saddle, settling the woman across his lap. Her head lolled against his chest, and a shudder ran through her small frame, a tremor so violent it seemed it might shake her apart. It was the first sign of her body fighting back. It had to be enough. He wrapped his coat around her as best he could, turned Gideon's head for home, and urged him into a slow, careful walk. The sun was a pale wafer in the sky, offering no warmth, and the long shadows of the mesas were already stretching across the plains, reaching for them like cold, dead fingers. The cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine logs hewn and set by his own hand. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and solitude. He shouldered the door open and carried the woman straight to the stone hearth, where the embers of the morning's fire still glowed faintly. He laid her down on the bearskin rug, her slight form looking impossibly fragile in the stark, masculine space. For a moment, he simply stood over her, lost. It had been years since another person had been in this room. Years since he had been responsible for anything more than his own survival and that of his livestock. The silence he had so carefully cultivated now felt accusing. He shook himself from the stupor. She was dying. That was the only truth that mattered. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements economical and sure. First, the fire. He added kindling and then larger logs, coaxing the embers back to a roaring blaze that began to push the oppressive chill from the room. The heat licked at the woman's frozen dress, and the smell of damp wool and mud filled the air. He knew he had to get the wet clothes off her, but the thought of touching her, of stripping away the last of her dignity, made his hands feel clumsy and foreign. He hesitated, his gaze falling on the simple gold band on her ring finger. It was new, untarnished. This was a bride, a runaway bride. Trouble. The word echoed in his mind, a low, persistent warning. He ignored it. He fetched a knife from the kitchen table and, with as much care as he could manage, began to cut away the ruined dress. The fabric was stiff and resisted the blade. He worked slowly, peeling back the layers of silk and lace, revealing skin that was mottled with blue and white patches. Frostbite. Bad. He cut away the last of the material, leaving her in a thin, torn chemise. He averted his eyes as he pulled 3 of the thickest wool quilts from his own bed and wrapped her tightly, cocooning her in their warmth. Her feet were the worst. He filled a basin with lukewarm water from the kettle, testing it carefully with his wrist. He did not want it too hot. He knew that could do more damage. He unwrapped the quilts just enough to expose her feet and gently submerged them in the water. She let out a soft, guttural moan, the first sound she had made, and her body arched against the rug. Her eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, glazed with a feverish terror. "Easy," he said, the words sounding loud and intrusive in the quiet room. "You are safe now." She stared at him, but he was not sure she saw him at all. She saw a man, and that seemed to be enough to ignite the fear that had been frozen inside her. She began to struggle, a weak, frantic thrashing within the heavy quilts. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "No, please, do not." "I am not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. He held her feet firmly but gently in the water. "You are freezing to death. You must be still." Her struggles subsided, not from trust, but from an exhaustion that went deeper than bone. Her eyes drifted shut again. He kept her feet in the water, changing it as it cooled, until some of the angry blue began to recede, replaced by a painful, flushed red. He dried them with a soft cloth and gently rubbed them with tallow. his touch as impersonal as a doctor's. Then he wrapped her feet in clean wool rags and tucked her back into the cocoon of quilts. He spent the next hour preparing a thin broth, boiling a piece of salted beef with a handful of dried onions until the water was a rich, savory brown. He propped her head up with a pillow from his bed and brought a spoonful of the hot liquid to her lips. At first, she would not take it. Her lips remained sealed, her head turning away on the pillow. "You have to drink," he urged, his patience wearing thin. "You will die if you do not." He touched the spoon to her mouth again, and this time, her lips parted slightly. He tilted the spoon, letting the warm broth trickle in. She swallowed, a convulsive movement in her throat. He gave her another spoonful, and then another. He fed her like a broken baby bird. The slow, repetitive process, a strange and unsettling intimacy. After half a cup, she turned her head away for good, her breathing falling into a shallow, ragged sleep. He sat back on his heels, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. He watched her breathe. He was a fool, a damn fool. He had brought the world and all its sorrows into his home. He looked at the ruined wedding dress, a heap of muddy silk by the door. It told a story he did not want to read. Darkness had fallen completely when her mind finally gave her the mercy of a memory. It came not as a story, but as a series of sharp, disjointed images, like shards of broken glass. The scent of wilting roses and too much perfume in a stuffy church, the weight of her father's hand on her arm, his grip like a manacle, her father's eyes, once so kind, now filled with a desperate, apologetic shame. He had lost everything, the ranch, the money, their good name, in a series of bad investments and worse poker hands. Annabeth was the last asset he had left to sell. The groom, Elias Thorne, stood at the altar, a man whose age was etched in the deep lines around his mouth and the cold, flat gray of his eyes. He was a cattle baron. A man who owned half the county and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed he could own people. 2. He smelled of whiskey and expensive cigars. When he took her hand, his fingers were thick and possessive, his thumbnail digging into her skin. She had flinched. He had smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips that did not reach his eyes. The wedding dinner was a blur of noise and forced smiles. Men slapped Elias on the back, their laughter too loud. Women looked at Annabeth with a mixture of pity and envy. She was now Mrs. Thorne. She was rich. She was safe. She felt like an animal in a cage. She could not eat. The fine food tasted like ash in her mouth. Later, in the master bedroom of his enormous, oppressively silent ranch house, the violence she had sensed in him came unbound. He had been drinking steadily all evening. When he turned to her, his movements were clumsy, but his intent was sharp and clear. "Take it off," he'd commanded, gesturing to her wedding dress, the one her mother had worn. She had stood frozen, her fingers fumbling with the tiny pearl buttons. He grew impatient. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed the front of the dress, his fist bunching the delicate fabric. He ripped it downwards. The sound of tearing silk was like a scream. "I paid a king's ransom for you," he'd slurred, his breath hot and sour against her cheek. "Your father's debts are settled. Now you will settle mine." He pushed her back onto the bed, his weight crushing her. She had fought then, a wild, panicked strength born of sheer terror. She had scratched and kicked, her only thought to get away, to get out from under him. Her struggle seemed only to amuse him at first, and then to anger him. His hand cracked across her face, the force of it sending a starburst of pain through her head. "You will learn to be still," he'd snarled. But in that moment of pain, her survival instinct took over. She brought her knee up hard, catching him in the groin. He roared in pain and surprise, stumbling back. It was all the time she needed. She scrambled off the bed and ran. She did not grab a coat or shoes. She did not think. She just ran from the room, down the grand staircase. and out the heavy front door into the shocking, biting cold of the night. She ran until her lungs burned and the house was just a distant light. She ran until the lights of the town were far behind her. She ran into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the prairie, with the wind tearing at her ruined dress and the frozen ground cutting her bare feet. She ran until she could not run anymore. She woke to the smell of coffee. The light in the cabin was gray and soft, the light of a new day. For a long moment, she did not know where she was. The quilts were heavy on her. The air was warm. The fire in the hearth was burning steadily. A man sat at a small wooden table, his back to her, a tin mug in his hand. He was large, but he was quiet. His shoulders were broad under a simple flannel shirt. He did not seem to know she was awake. She watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was just sitting there, staring into his cup, but every nerve in her body screamed danger. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned his head slowly. His face was weathered, his features stark, as if carved from the unforgiving land itself. A thick, dark beard covered his jaw, but it could not hide the sadness that seemed permanently etched around his eyes. They were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no threat. They just looked tired. He stood up and walked over to the hearth. He ladled more of the broth from the pot into a bowl and brought it to her, kneeling beside the bearskin rug just as he had before. "You should eat," he said. His voice was low, a gravelly baritone that seemed to be out of practice. She pushed herself up on her elbows, the quilts pooling around her waist. She was still in her chemise. A flush of shame warmed her cheeks. She took the bowl from him, her hands trembling so badly that the broth sloshed over the sides. She drank it greedily, the warmth spreading through her chest, chasing away some of the deep, internal chill. He watched her for a moment, then went back to his table. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. It was not the oppressive silence of Elias Thorne's house, but an empty, waiting silence. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the pale winter sun. He never asked her name. He never asked where she came from or what had happened to her. He simply tended to her. He kept the fire lit. He fed her broth, and then thicker stews as her strength returned. He treated the angry sores on her feet, his touch gentle and impersonal. He moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose, giving her a wide berth, as if she were a spooked deer he was afraid of scaring off. He slept in a chair by the fire, leaving his bed for her. She never took it, preferring the safety of the hearth. One afternoon, while he was outside tending to his animals, she found the courage to stand. Her legs were weak and shaky, but they held her. She walked to the cabin's single window and looked out. The landscape was a crushing monotony of white and brown. A small barn stood 100 yards away, and a handful of cattle huddled together for warmth in a rough corral. There was nothing else. No roads, no other homes. Just an endless expanse of wilderness. She was in the middle of nowhere. She was utterly, completely alone with this strange, silent man. Slowly, a routine began to form. She started to help. She washed the few dishes they used, her movements slow and deliberate. She swept the rough planked floor. She mended a tear in one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. These small tasks anchored her, pulling her back from the edge of the dark pit of her memories. She learned his name was Silas. She saw it carved into the handle of a hunting knife on the mantel. Silas. It felt solid, like the man himself. He wrote a letter one evening, scratching away with a pen and ink by the light of a kerosene lamp. She watched him, her curiosity warring with her fear. He folded it, sealed it with wax, and addressed it to Reverend Michael of Dagger Rock. Her breath caught in her throat. He was going to turn her in. The next morning, he rode out, and she spent the day in a state of quiet panic, waiting for the sheriff to appear. But he returned at dusk, alone, with a small sack of horehound candies he'd placed on the table without a word. The letter, she realized, had said nothing of her. He was protecting her. But why? That night, the wind rose, a low moan that grew into a feral shriek. It rattled the window pane and hurled handfuls of sleet against the log walls. The cabin, which had started to feel like a shelter, now felt like a fragile ship in a vast, violent sea. The sound of the wind was too much like the sound of her own screaming in her memory. It broke something inside her. A sob escaped her, a raw, ugly sound that she could not hold back. And then another, and another, the dam of her control, so carefully constructed over the past days, shattered completely. She curled into a ball on the bearskin rug, her face buried in her hands, and wept. She wept for her lost family, for the girl she used to be, for the violence that had been done to her. She wept from a place of grief so deep she thought it might swallow her whole. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle at the table, went still. She felt his presence beside her, but she could not stop crying. She expected him to speak, to offer clumsy words of comfort, or, worse, to tell her to be quiet. He did neither. She felt a gentle weight, a warmth, cover her trembling hand. She looked up through her tears. He was kneeling beside her, his large, calloused hand completely covering hers. His face was a mask of shadows in the firelight, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a profound, shared sorrow. He said nothing. He did not need to. The simple, solid pressure of his hand was an anchor in the storm that was tearing her apart. It said, "I am here. You are not alone in this darkness." He did not move. He just knelt there, his hand on hers. As the wind howled outside and her sobs slowly subsided into ragged, exhausted breaths, when she finally fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. He was still there, and when the first pale light of dawn crept through the window, he had not let go. Spring did not arrive in the Wyoming territory with a gentle announcement. It came violently, tearing the land from winter's grip. The thaw was a messy, brutal affair. Snowbanks sagged and wept, turning the hard-packed ground into a sucking mire of mud. The creeks, choked with ice for months, broke free with a roar, their waters running high and brown and angry. The air, once sharp and sterile, now smelled of damp earth and the decay of what had been buried. And yet, there was life. A stubborn green haze appeared on the distant hills, and birds with voices rusty from disuse began to call to one another in the pale morning light. The world was waking up, but for Silas and Annabeth, the isolation remained as profound as ever. The mud made the trail to Dagger Rock impassable for weeks, cutting them off completely. Their world shrank to the size of the small cabin, the barn, and the muddy patch of ground that connected them. Inside this small world, a different kind of thaw was taking place, one just as slow and uncertain as the season's turn. Annabeth's body mended. The bruises on her face faded from a violent purple to a sickly yellow, and then vanished altogether, leaving behind only the ghost of a memory in the way she sometimes flinched from a sudden movement. The sores on her feet healed into thin, pink scars. Color returned to her cheeks, and the gaunt, hunted look in her eyes was slowly replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She began to eat with a healthy appetite, and the strength flowed back into her limbs. With that strength came a need to be useful. She had spent her life being ornamental, taught to arrange flowers and stitch fine samplers and pour tea. Here, those skills were useless, so she learned new ones. She learned the heft of an iron skillet and how to bake bread that rose dense and hearty. She learned to pluck a grouse, her initial revulsion giving way to the simple necessity of the task. She learned to mend the thick canvas of Silas's work coat with strong, practical stitches that would hold against the wind. Her presence began to change the cabin. It was no longer just a man's austere shelter. A jar of pussy willows appeared on the mantelpiece. The scent of baking bread often overpowered the lingering smell of wood smoke and old leather. She washed the single window until the weak spring sunlight streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She did not rearrange his few belongings or try to impose her will on the space. Instead, she softened its edges, her quiet industry a balm on the harshness of the room and on the man who inhabited it. Silas watched it all from behind a wall of silence he had spent years perfecting. He had his own ghosts, and they did not sleep soundly. The nights were the worst. When the fire burned low and the cabin was filled with the soft sound of Annabeth's breathing from her cot near the hearth, his mind would betray him, dragging him back to the mud and blood of Shiloh. He would see it in flashes, the images seared onto the backs of his eyelids, the bright, terrible bloom of a cannon blast against a gray sky, the high, thin scream of a dying horse, the face of the boy from Ohio, no older than 16, who had looked at Silas with such surprise as the life drained out of him. And always, it ended with Sarah. He would be home on a brief furlough, the war a distant nightmare, her hands in his. Then the fever came, swift and merciless, a thief in the night. He saw the sweat on her brow, heard the rattle in her chest, felt her last, shuddering breath against his cheek. He had survived the cannons and the bullets only to come home and watch his wife and unborn child be stolen by an enemy he could not fight. He would wake with a choked gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs. The quilt kicked to the floor, the cold air of the cabin a poor substitute for the cold that lived permanently in his soul. He would look over at Annabeth, a dark shape in the faint moonlight, and the guilt of his survival would wash over him, bitter and suffocating. He tried to keep his distance. He would rise before dawn and be out of the cabin before she stirred, finding work in the far corners of his property, mending fences or clearing brush, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. He would eat the meals she prepared with a quiet nod of thanks, his eyes fixed on his plate. He tried to rebuild the wall between them, to treat her as a temporary charge, a problem to be solved and sent on its way. But the quiet intimacy of their life together was a slow, persistent tide, eroding his defenses. It was in the way she handed him a hot mug of coffee in the morning, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. It was in the comfortable silence that fell between them in the evenings as he patched a piece of tack and she darned a sock. The only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the needle through wool. It was in the shared, unspoken language of their chores. When he brought in a pail of milk, she would be ready with the strainer. When she tended to the small herb garden she had started near the door, he would leave a bucket of fresh water for her. They were two solitary planets who had fallen into a strange, silent orbit, and the gravitational pull was growing stronger every day. He found himself watching her when she was not looking, noticing the way the light caught the gold in her hair, the focused set of her mouth as she kneaded dough, the rare, fleeting smile that touched her lips when one of the barn cats rubbed against her leg. She was bringing life back to a place that had been consecrated to death, and it terrified him. One evening, as she was clearing away their dinner plates, she spoke, her voice so soft he almost did not hear her over the hiss of the fire. "My father," she began, her back still to him. "He did not want this for me. I want you to know that." Silas stopped cleaning the blade of his knife and looked at her. She had not spoken of her past, not once since that first night. He had not asked. "He was a good man," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "A kind man, but he was weak. He trusted the wrong people, made promises he could not keep. Elias Thorne owned all his debts. He owned him, and so he came to own me." She turned to face him then, her eyes dark with a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "It was a transaction. He told me it was the only way to save our family's name. He called it my duty. The wedding. It was a celebration of a sale." She recounted the story in a low, flat monotone, as if she were speaking of someone else. The pressure, the threats disguised as concerns for her welfare, the coldness of the man she was forced to marry. She spoke of the wedding night, her words becoming clipped and sparse, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. She did not share the ugliest details, but she did not have to. The horror was plain in the rigid set of her shoulders and the bloodless white of her knuckles as she gripped the edge of the table. "He said I belonged to him now," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Like one of his cattle, something he had bought and paid for." She finally looked at Silas, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. I am not clean anymore. Silas." The words hung in the air between them, stark and wounded. It was the deepest fear of a woman in a world that prized purity above all else, a stain that could never be washed away. Silas felt the truth of it in his gut, the brutal, unfair judgment of the world she had escaped. He thought of the things he had done in the war, the men he had killed, the blood on his hands. He thought of his own failure to protect his wife, a stain of a different kind, but one that marked his soul just as deeply. He looked at this broken, brave woman, and he felt a kinship with her that went beyond pity. It was a kinship of the damned. He rose from his chair and walked to the hearth, poking at the logs until they sparked and flared. He took his time, choosing his words with a care he rarely afforded them. "Annabeth," he said, speaking her name for the first time. It felt strange and right on his tongue. He turned to face her. "No one gets through this life clean." His voice was a low rumble, but the words landed with the force of a revelation. He was not dismissing her pain or offering cheap comfort. He was stating a fact, a fundamental truth of their shared existence. He was pulling her out of the lonely prison of her shame and placing her beside him in a world of flawed, wounded people. He was telling her that her scars did not make her an outcast. They simply made her human. She stared at him, her lips parted, and for the first time, a single tear traced a clean path through the grime of her sorrow. The storm rolled in a week later, a monster of black clouds that swallowed the afternoon sun and turned the sky the color of a bruise. The first clap of thunder was a distant rumble, but it grew steadily, a deep-throated growl that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the plains in brief, terrifying flashes of white. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Annabeth tried to busy herself, scrubbing a pot with a furious energy that did nothing to quell the rising panic in her chest. The violent cracking of the thunder was too much like the sound of Elias Thorne's hand striking her face, too much like the tearing of her dress. Each flash of lightning made her jump, her heart seizing with a primal fear she could not control. Silas watched her from the table where he was mending a bridle. He saw the growing terror in her eyes, the way her knuckles were white on the handle of the pot. He said nothing, but his presence was a steady, quiet weight in the room. When a bolt of lightning struck a pine tree on the nearby ridge with an explosive crack that sounded like the end of the world, she cried out, dropping the pot with a clatter. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling uncontrollably. Without a word, Silas stood up, walked to his bed in the corner of the room, and pulled back the thick wool blankets. It was not an invitation to passion. It was an offer of sanctuary. He went and sat in his chair by the fire, turning his back to give her privacy. For a long moment, she remained frozen. Then, moving like a sleepwalker, she crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. She was still fully dressed in her simple work dress. She slipped under the covers and curled into a tight ball, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The bed smelled of him, of pine smoke and clean sweat and the faint, metallic scent of the outdoors. It was the scent of safety. The storm raged for hours. Through it all, Annabeth lay in the dark, listening to the two sounds that kept her tethered to sanity, the steady crackle of the fire and the quiet, rhythmic sound of Silas's breathing from the chair. Just after midnight, the storm reached its zenith. A deafening clap of thunder directly overhead shook the cabin so violently, a tin plate fell from a shelf. Annabeth whimpered, a small animal sound of pure terror. She heard the scrape of the chair, and then his weight settled on the edge of the bed. She did not flinch. He reached out and gently pulled the blankets over her shoulder where they had slipped. Then, he lay down on top of the covers beside her, his body a solid, warm barrier between her and the raging storm. He did not touch her, save for the reassuring weight of his presence. He lay on his back, fully clothed, his hands laced behind his head, staring up at the dark ceiling. Slowly, Annabeth uncurled from her tight ball of fear. She shifted onto her side, turning to face him. In the darkness, he was just a silhouette, a mountain of quiet strength. Hesitantly, she reached out a hand and rested it on his chest. She could feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her palm. He did not move, but she felt the slight rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. He lay there, a silent guardian, and she closed her eyes, the sound of his heartbeat drowning out the fury of the storm. He held her with his stillness, with his quiet promise of protection, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt completely safe. He stayed there, a warm and solid presence in the darkness, until the storm passed and the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds. The passable roads brought the world back to them, and with it, trouble. Silas rode into Dagger Rock for supplies and found the town buzzing with gossip. A rich cattle baron from the south had put out a notice, a handsome reward for any information leading to the return of his runaway wife. The descriptions were vague, but Silas's blood ran cold. A few days later, the trouble rode right up to his door. A man on a tall gray horse, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place against the rugged landscape. He was thin, with a narrow face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself as Mr. Peters, a land agent, but Silas knew a liar when he saw one. "Just passing through," the man said, his smile thin and oily. "Surveying for the railroad. Heard there was a squatter out this way. Kane, is it?" "This is my land," Silas said, his voice flat. He stood on the porch of the cabin, his body blocking the doorway, his hand resting casually on the axe handle leaning against the wall. "Homesteaded, legal." Of course," Peters said, his eyes darting past Silas, trying to peer into the shadows of the cabin. "Fine-looking spread for one man. Must get lonely out here. Not much company to be had." "I like it that way," Silas said. "I am sure you do. It is just, there are rumors in town about a woman. Some folks say a man out this way might have taken in a stray, a young woman in some distress." The man's eyes gleamed with a predatory curiosity. Silas's face remained a mask of stone. He stared at Peters, his gaze so cold and steady that the other man's smile began to falter. "Folks in town have too much time for talk. I have not seen anyone. Now, if you are done surveying my porch, I have work to do." Peters held his gaze for a long moment, then seemed to decide that pushing the issue was not worth the risk. He gave a curt nod, his smile gone completely. "My apologies for disturbing your work, Mr. Kane." He turned his horse and rode away. Silas watched him until he was a small speck on the horizon. He did not relax until the man was completely gone. He went back inside the cabin. Annabeth was standing by the window, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had heard everything. "He knows," she whispered. "He will be back." "He knows nothing," Silas said, but his words lacked conviction. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered. The world was coming for her. They both knew they would have to run, but the knowledge was a terrifying, formless thing. Where could they go? The West was a vast, empty country, but a man with Elias Thorne's money and influence had a very long reach. For the first time, the future was not a distant abstraction, but a rapidly approaching threat. The next morning, the air was thick with unspoken tension. They moved around each other, the easy silence of their routine now strained. The conversation with Peters had laid bare the precarity of their situation. Every snap of a twig outside, every distant bird call, sounded like the hoofbeats of returning danger. Annabeth was kneading dough for the morning's bread. her movements jerky and uncertain. Silas was standing by the open door, cleaning his rifle, his eyes scanning the horizon. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual. A wave of guilt washed over her. She had brought this danger to his door. She had shattered the solitude he had so carefully built. She finished her task and washed her hands in the basin. She walked over to where he stood, his back to her. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to apologize, but the words would not form. All the fear and gratitude and the strange, terrifying new hope that he had sparked in her rose up in her throat and choked her. So she acted instead. She stood on her toes and gently, timidly, pressed her lips against his rough, bearded cheek. It was a chaste, fleeting kiss, as light as a butterfly's wing, but it was loaded with everything she could not say. It was a kiss of thanks, a kiss of trust, a kiss that acknowledged the fragile, unspoken thing that was growing between them in the quiet spaces of their shared life. Silas went rigid. For a long second, he did not move, did not breathe. She started to pull away, a hot flush of embarrassment rising in her cheeks, certain she had crossed a line. But then his hand came up, not to push her away, but to rest gently on her arm, stopping her retreat. He turned his head slowly and looked down at her. His eyes were dark and unreadable, a stormy sea of emotions he kept locked away. He did not pull her closer. He did not deepen the kiss. He simply stood there, his hand on her arm, his gaze holding hers. In that space between them, 1,000 questions hung in the air. It was a moment suspended in time, fragile and uncertain. A quiet question asked in the long, tense moments before the dawn. The kiss lingered in the air between them long after it was over. A silent, shimmering thing. It had changed the texture of the silence in the cabin, charging it with a new and volatile energy. They moved through their chores with a careful, deliberate awareness of each other, like two dancers learning a new and dangerous rhythm. Averted glances held more weight than spoken words, and the accidental brush of their hands as they passed in the narrow space was enough to send a jolt through the quiet air. The land outside mirrored the tension within. Spring was a raw and unsettled season, the ground soft and vulnerable, the air still holding a memory of winter's bite. The landscape was a canvas of harsh beauty, scarred by deep ravines and dotted with stubborn, windswept pines that clung to life with a fierce tenacity. It was a place that understood survival, a place that knew the cost of letting your guard down. One afternoon, Silas broke the routine. He stood in the doorway, his shadow falling long into the room, and spoke without looking at her. "The buckskin needs a run. You should come." It was not a question, but it was not a command either. It was a simple statement of fact, an offering. Annabeth looked up from the shirt she was mending, a needle poised in her hand. A flicker of fear, old and instinctive, tightened her chest. But when she looked at his back, at the solid, steady set of his shoulders, the fear subsided. He had never given her a reason to be afraid. He saddled Gideon for himself and the gentler of his 2 mares, a sweet-tempered roan named Dust Devil, for her. He helped her mount, his hands strong and impersonal on her waist as he lifted her. Her worn work dress was ill-suited for riding astride, but she did not care. As they set out, the rhythm of the horse moving beneath her felt like a kind of freedom she had forgotten existed. They rode past the confines of the valley, climbing a trail that wound up into the mesas. From the top, the world opened up, a vast, breathtaking expanse of plains and sky. The wind was a living thing up here, whipping her hair from its pins and bringing a high, healthy color to her cheeks. Silas led them down the other side to a long, dry flat, a stretch of land as level as a tabletop. He reined Gideon to a stop and turned in his saddle to look at her. "She has a good gait. Let her have her head." Annabeth hesitated, her hands tight on the reins. Then she saw the look in his eyes, not a challenge, but a quiet encouragement. She nudged the mare with her heels, gently at first, and then with more confidence. Dust Devil broke into a canter, and then a full, glorious gallop. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Annabeth was not running from something. She was running toward the horizon, toward the sheer, exhilarating joy of movement and speed. The wind tore the breath from her lungs and whistled past her ears, wiping her mind clean of everything but the pounding of hooves on the hard-packed earth and the sun on her face. A sound bubbled up from deep inside her, a sound she did not recognize at first. It was laughter. Not a polite, girlish laugh, but a raw, unburdened sound of pure joy, wild and free as the land around her. Silas did not join her. He held Gideon back, watching her. He watched her as if he had never seen light before. He saw the woman she was beneath the layers of trauma and fear, a flash of vibrant, unbreakable spirit against the harsh, unforgiving landscape. And in that moment, the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbled to dust. He was not just protecting a stray. He was sheltering a flame he could not bear to see extinguished. That night, the charged silence in the cabin was unbearable. They ate their meal of rabbit stew and fresh bread without a word, but their eyes met across the small table, and the question that had been hovering between them for weeks finally demanded an answer. After they had cleaned up, she stood by the hearth, her back to the fire, its warmth a stark contrast to the nervous chill that ran through her. Silas stood by the door, staring out at the sliver of moon in the ink-black sky, as if he might simply walk out into the night and never return. But he did not. He turned, his face half hidden in shadow, and walked slowly toward her. He stopped a foot away, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not speak. He simply raised a hand and gently, with a reverence that made her breath catch, he touched her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch rough and calloused but unbelievably tender. It was all the invitation she needed. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. It was a surrender, but not a defeat. He lowered his head and his lips met hers. This kiss was nothing like the chaste, timid gesture she had offered before. It was deep and searching, a desperate, silent conversation. It spoke of loneliness and grief, of shared wounds and the stubborn, improbable hope for something more. He scooped her into his arms and carried her the few feet to his bed in the corner. He laid her down gently on the coarse wool blankets and began to undress her, his movements slow and deliberate in the flickering firelight. Then he undressed himself. They lay side by side, skin to skin, in a room full of silence. There were no declarations, no promises whispered in the dark. Their bodies spoke a language older and more honest than words. It was a conversation without language, an exploration of unfamiliar territory, a mapping of scars, both visible and unseen. His touch was not the brutal, possessive grasp of Elias Thorne. It was a question, a comfort, a prayer. For Annabeth, it was a revelation. This was what it meant to be with a man, not to be taken, but to be met. For Silas, it was an act of profound and terrifying vulnerability, letting another soul into the desolate fortress of his heart. It was just warmth in the cold, a desperate clinging, an answer to a question neither had dared to ask. It was two broken people piecing each other together in the dark. Afterward, they lay tangled in the blankets, the fire burning down to glowing embers. The silence returned, but it was different now, filled with a shared, fragile peace. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the edges of the window, a sliver of fear, cold and sharp, pierced Annabeth's heart. The dawn was coming. The world, with all its dangers and judgments, was coming. She pressed herself closer to the solid warmth of his body and whispered the words that had been sleeping in her soul. "Hold me tight before dawn." His arm tightened around her, pulling her so close she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back. He held her as if he could shield her from the rising sun, from the entire world, and he did. The morning light brought with it the harsh return of reality. Guilt and fear were cold companions in the small cabin. Silas sat at the table, his coffee untouched, his face a grim mask. The act of love, which had felt so right and necessary in the dark, now felt like a reckless, selfish indulgence. He had pulled her deeper into his broken world, further endangering her. "You should not be here," he said, his voice a low rasp. He would not look at her. "You deserve better than this, better than a broken man in a forgotten corner of the world." Annabeth, dressed again in her worn clothes, came and stood behind him. She placed her hands on his broad shoulders. He was rigid beneath her touch. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you are the first man who has not hurt me." He flinched as if she had struck him. The simple, devastating truth of her words dismantled his self-loathing more effectively than any argument. He had no answer for that. The world did not wait for them to sort through the tangle of their emotions. A few days later, Silas returned from a trip to Dagger Rock with a grim set to his jaw and a folded handbill in his pocket. He smoothed it out on the table. It was a bounty notice. Elias Thorne was offering $500, a fortune, for information leading to the recovery of his wife, Annabeth Thorne. A detailed description followed, leaving no room for doubt. Below it was a more sinister addendum, a separate reward for the man who was harboring her, to be charged with theft of property and obstruction of justice. Their secret was no longer just a matter of gossip. It was a matter of money and law. Any man who saw her would see a walking fortune. Any man who helped them would be risking his own neck. The final nail in the coffin of their isolation came a week later, in the form of a visit from the preacher. Reverend Michael was a kind, aging man with watery blue eyes and a gentle disposition. He had been a friend to Silas, one of the few people who had not judged him for his solitary life. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon, ostensibly to check on Silas's welfare. Silas met him on the porch, his body once again a barrier to the inside of the cabin. They spoke of the weather, the price of cattle, the health of the town, but the preacher's eyes kept straying to the open doorway behind Silas. "It is good to see you are well, my son," the Reverend said, his gaze settling on something inside. "It is not good for a man to be alone. The good Lord himself said so." Silas followed his gaze, hanging on a peg by the door. Forgotten in the haste of the morning was a woman's shawl, a simple paisley thing Annabeth had found in an old trunk and adopted as her own. It was a soft, feminine object in a starkly masculine world. It was a confession. The preacher's eyes met Silas's, and they were filled not with accusation, but with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He did not ask the question. He did not need to. He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. "Be careful, Silas. There are cruel men in this world, and they often use the law for their own cruel ends. The Lord's protection be upon you." He turned and left. The visit was a warning. The town knew, the preacher knew. It was only a matter of time. That night, Silas was tormented. He sat by the fire long after Annabeth had gone to sleep, the bounty notice in his hand, the preacher's words echoing in his mind. He was bringing ruin upon her. By keeping her here, he was making her a bigger target, a prize for bounty hunters. If he were caught with her, they would hang him and drag her back to Thorne, and her fate would be worse than before. A terrible, logical thought crept into his mind. He could turn her in himself. He could take her to the sheriff in Dagger Rock, claim he had just found her, and wash his hands of it. It would be a betrayal, but would it not be better for her in the end? The law, however flawed, might offer her some protection that he could not. It was a cold and ugly calculation, and it made him sick to his stomach, unable to bear the confines of the cabin. He went outside. The night air was cool and clean. He walked to the barn, the familiar smells of hay and animals a small comfort. He peered into the gloom, and his eyes fell on a scene that stopped his heart. In an empty stall, curled up in a nest of clean hay, Annabeth was asleep and curled up on her chest. A tiny ball of black and white fur was a kitten, one of the new litter from the barn cat. Her hand rested on its back, rising and falling with its tiny breaths. Her face, in the faint moonlight filtering through a crack in the wall, was completely at peace, unguarded and serene. He saw in that moment the profound, gentle goodness in her, the instinct to nurture and protect even the smallest of creatures. He saw the life she had brought back to his deadened world, and he realized, with a clarity that cut through all his fear and rationalization, that he could no more turn her over to her fate than he could cut out his own heart. She was not a problem to be solved. She was a life to be defended. His life. He went back to the cabin. His decision made, he woke her gently. "Annabeth, we have to go." She was instantly awake, the sleepiness vanishing from her eyes, replaced by a clear, steady focus. "Where?" "West," he said. "Oregon, maybe. There is still land there. A man can disappear." And so they began. They did not have much, but they prepared what they had with a grim efficiency. Silas packed dried meat, flour, and beans into canvas saddlebags. Annabeth filled canteens with water and bundled their few spare clothes and blankets. They worked together in the dim light of the cabin, their movements synchronized, a team forged in silence and desperation. The next afternoon, he took her down to a shallow, fast-moving creek a mile from the cabin. He carried his Colt Peacemaker and a newer, more accurate Winchester rifle. He set up a tin can on a rock 50 yards away. "You need to know how to use this," he said, handing her the rifle. It was heavy and awkward in her arms. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. His instructions were clear and concise, the voice of a soldier who had lived and died by these rules. He stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, his body a steady presence. The first shot went wide, the recoil knocking her off balance. The second was closer. She was a fast learner, her focus intense. By the 10th shot, the tin can jumped into the air. A small, fierce smile of satisfaction touched her lips. She was not just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. That evening, they sat by the creek as the sun went down, painting the sky in brilliant, aching shades of orange and purple. The air grew cool, and a profound sadness settled over them. They were leaving the first place either of them had felt safe in a long time. It was not a home, but it had been a shelter. Annabeth leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not stiffen or pull away. He let her stay, his arm coming to rest around her. They watched the last of the light fade from the sky, and the first stars appear. "I am scared, Silas," she whispered into the twilight. "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. "So am I." She turned her head, her cheek resting against the rough wool of his shirt. She looked up at his stern, sad profile against the dying light. She thought of the life she had left, a gilded cage of expectations and cruelty, and the life she was running toward, a terrifying unknown. And she thought of the man beside her, a man of few words and profound kindness, a man who saw her not as property or a sinner, but as a person worthy of saving. "I do not want to survive alone," she said, her voice clear and strong in the growing dark. She lifted her head and met his gaze, her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering resolve. "I want to survive with you." They left the cabin like ghosts, slipping out into the deep, moonless dark that comes just before a false dawn. There were no goodbyes, no last looks at the small shelter that had been their world. To look back was to invite regret, and regret was a luxury they could not afford. They took only what they could carry on their 3 horses, Silas on Gideon, Annabeth on the mare, and the 3rd horse, a sturdy pack animal, loaded with their meager supplies. They did not take the main trail, but instead plunged into a network of old, abandoned mining paths that wound through the Badlands like scars on the earth. The journey was a brutal baptism. The trails were treacherous, often crumbling away into steep, scree-filled ravines, They rode through a desolate, skeletal forest where a fire years ago had left behind an army of charred, black-fingered trees that clawed at the sky. The days were a grueling monotony of riding, their world shrinking to the space between their horses' ears. They spoke little, saving their energy for the physical demands of the trail. The silence was different here. It was not the comfortable quiet of the cabin, but the vast, predatory silence of the wilderness. A silence that listened for any sign of weakness. The nights were a different kind of hell. The cold sank its teeth into them the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. They made small, smokeless fires in the shelter of rock outcroppings. But the heat was a fleeting comfort against the bone-deep chill that crept in from the darkness. Their food was rationed with a grim precision. A strip of dried beef, a handful of cold beans, a cup of bitter coffee. Hunger became a constant, dull ache in their bellies. They slept in shifts, one watching while the other collapsed into a shallow, unrestful sleep. The rifle never more than an arm's length away. On the 5th day, their fragile luck ran out. The pack horse, laden with the bulk of their precious food and supplies, stumbled on a patch of loose shale, its foreleg buckled with a sickening crack that echoed in the unnerving quiet. The animal screamed, a sound of pure agony that tore at Annabeth's heart. Silas was at its side in an instant, his face a grim, stony mask. He ran his hands down the horse's leg, his touch gentle, his diagnosis swift and final. The bone was shattered. There was nothing to be said. Annabeth watched as Silas unloaded their supplies, his movements economical and devoid of emotion. He transferred what little they could now carry to their own mounts, the weight a new burden on the already tired animals. When he was done, he stood by the injured horse's head, stroking its neck and murmuring soft, low words she could not hear. The horse quieted, its large, dark eyes full of a trusting pain. "Turn away," Silas said to her, his voice rough. She understood. She walked 100 paces down the trail, her back to him, and wrapped her arms around herself. She did not want to hear it, but the sound of the single, sharp gunshot was inescapable. It was a sound of mercy and a sound of failure. When she turned back, Silas was walking toward her, his face ashen, his eyes hollowed out. He did not look back at the fallen animal. They had just lost half their food and their best chance of moving quickly. The wilderness had claimed its first tithe. They pushed on, the loss hanging over them like a shroud. 2 days later, starved for a fresh source of water, they were forced to descend from the high, hidden trails toward a river they could see glinting in the valley below. The risk was immense. Riverbeds were natural highways, and they were far more likely to encounter other travelers. But they had no choice. They found the river and were letting their horses drink when they heard the voices. A group of 5 men were coming around a bend in the river, leading a train of mules laden with mining equipment. They were a rough-looking crew, their faces bearded and grimed with dirt, their clothes worn and patched. There was no avoiding them. Silas's hand went to the butt of his Colt. "Keep your eyes down," he murmured to Annabeth. "Let me do the talking." The men drew up short when they saw them. Their leader, a big man with a tangle of red hair and a mean-looking scar that cut through one eyebrow, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's horse. "Did not figure to see folks out in this part of the country," the man said, his eyes raking over them, lingering on Annabeth. "Just passing through," Silas said, his voice flat and even. He kept his horse between the men and Annabeth. "Headed for the Green River." "Long way to go for a picnic," the man grunted. One of the other miners, a younger, weaselly-looking man, was staring intently at Annabeth, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I know you," the young miner said suddenly, his voice sharp with discovery. He pointed a grimy finger at her. "I seen you in Dagger Rock. You were with Preacher Michael that one time. You are that runaway wife the cattle baron is looking for, the one with the $500 reward." The air crackled with a sudden, violent tension. The word award hung in the air, glittering and dangerous. The red-bearded leader looked from Annabeth to Silas, a greedy light dawning in his eyes. $500 was more money than any of them would see in a year of breaking their backs in a mine. In a single, fluid motion, Silas drew his Colt, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "You have made a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly growl. At the same instant, Annabeth pulled the Winchester from its saddle scabbard. She did not hesitate. She levered around into the chamber and brought the rifle to her shoulder. Its barrel pointed squarely at the chest of the man who had recognized her. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady, her eyes narrowed and fierce. The miners froze, their eyes wide with surprise. They had seen a lone man and a frightened woman. They now saw two determined people, armed and ready to kill. The red-bearded leader looked at the unwavering barrel of Silas's Colt, then at the equally steady rifle in Annabeth's hands. He calculated the odds. Maybe they could take them, but at least two of his own men would likely die in the first few seconds. He looked at the hard, empty cold in Silas's eyes and knew this was a man who would not miss. "Hold on now. Jed," the leader said to the younger miner, his voice losing its aggressive edge. "You are probably mistaken. All them women look alike." He turned his gaze back to Silas, a grudging respect in his eyes. "We do not want any trouble here." "Then ride on," Silas said, his gun not wavering. The leader hesitated, the thought of the money warring with his instinct for self-preservation. He spat on the ground again. "It is not worth it," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Never get involved in rich men's business. It is a good way to get yourself killed." He gave a curt nod to his men and pulled his lead mule's rope, urging his train past them. They gave Silas and Annabeth a wide berth, their eyes averted. The young miner, Jed, cast one last, venomous look at Annabeth before he was gone. They stood there, their guns raised, until the sound of the miners and their mules had faded completely down the riverbank. Only then did they lower their weapons. Annabeth's arms were trembling, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving her weak and shaky. She had been ready to kill a man. The thought was both terrifying and strangely empowering. Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You did good," he said, the words a quiet acknowledgement of her transformation. They rode on, but the encounter had shaken them badly. The illusion of their isolation was gone. The world was out there, and it was hunting them. That night, they found a small, sheltered canyon to make camp. The close call had broken something in Silas. His silence, usually a stoic comfort, was now heavy and tormented. He moved with a grim, brittle tension, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on a past that only he could see. Annabeth watched him, a sense of dread growing in her. The man who had faced down 5 armed miners without flinching was now being stalked by his own ghosts. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. She could feel the storm raging inside him, the pressure building behind the dam of his control. And finally, it broke. "We should have never left the cabin," he whispered. His voice choked. "I am going to get you killed. It is what I do." "That is not true, Silas," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "Is it not?" He let out a harsh, broken sound that was half laugh, half sob. "I bring ruin. I always have." He finally looked at her, and the raw, unshielded agony in his eyes stole her breath. The walls were gone. The fortress was in ruins. All that was left was the wounded man inside. "I killed my best friend," he said, the words torn from him. His name was Caleb. We grew up together in Ohio, joined up together when the war started. We were more like brothers than friends. He began to speak, the story pouring out of him in a torrent, a confession held back for more than a decade. He spoke of a Union raid on a Confederate supply line, a chaotic, ill-planned affair in the pouring rain and the dead of night. It was all smoke and confusion, Shouting and gunfire. He and Caleb were fighting back to back. A figure loomed out of the swirling smoke, a shadow with a rifle. Silas had reacted on instinct, firing before he could think. The figure had dropped. It was not until the smoke cleared for a moment that he saw the face of the man he had shot. It was Caleb. He had gotten turned around in the chaos. He had come at Silas from the wrong direction. "He just looked at me," Silas said, his voice cracking, his gaze lost in the memory. He had this surprised look on his face. He tried to say my name. I held him while he died in the mud, my brother, and I killed him. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He had never told anyone. He had carried the guilt and the shame like a shroud, letting it poison his life, letting it drive him into the wilderness, away from anyone else he might hurt. He saw himself as a cursed man, his hands stained with the blood of the one person who had trusted him completely. Annabeth felt her own heart break for him. She did not offer empty words of comfort or absolution. There were none. Instead, she moved closer and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly as the grief he had suppressed for so long finally tore its way out of him. She held him until the shaking subsided, until he was just a man, exhausted and empty, in the arms of a woman who refused to see him as a monster. She gently took his hand and brought it to her lips, kissing the calloused knuckles. Then she began to kiss his face, his tear-stained cheeks, his eyelids, the lines of pain around his mouth. She kissed the old, faded scar on his temple, a relic from the same war that had given him his deeper, invisible wounds. Her kisses were not about passion, but about acceptance. She was kissing his scars, all of them, acknowledging his pain and telling him, without words, that it did not make him unworthy of love. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, desperate need. He pulled her to him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was worlds away from their first tender exploration. This was a kiss of desperation, of two drowning people clinging to the same piece of wreckage. It was a frantic, hungry thing, a futile attempt to erase everything the world had ever done to them. They made love there on the hard ground by the dying fire, their movements urgent and almost violent. It was not gentle or tender. It was a raw, aching collision of two souls stripped bare of all their defenses. It was a frantic assertion of life in the face of so much death, a desperate attempt to burn away the ghosts that haunted them. They were trying to lose themselves in each other, to find a moment of oblivion in a world that offered them no peace. A storm blew in before morning, the wind howling through the canyon and hurling icy rain against their small shelter. They packed up in the miserable dark and rode on, the weather as bleak as their moods. By midday, the rain had turned to a driving sleet. They were soaked through, their bodies numb with cold. They had to find shelter. They stumbled upon it by sheer luck, an old, abandoned way station, a relic from a stagecoach line that had gone defunct years ago. It was a sad, collapsing structure, its roof sagging, its windows long since broken out, but it had 4 walls and a semblance of a roof, and that was enough. They led the horses into the relative shelter of the main room, their hooves echoing in the empty, derelict space. Silas managed to start a small fire in the stone hearth with the last of their dry tinder. They huddled before it, shivering, their clothes steaming in the heat. The way station was a ghost of a place, filled with the echoes of 1,000 forgotten travelers. The wind moaned through the gaps in the walls, sounding like lost souls. Annabeth looked at the darkness pressing in on them, at the shadows dancing on the decaying walls. The fragile sense of life they had found in each other's arms the night before was gone, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their flight. They were 2 small, hunted creatures in a vast and hostile world. The fear, always lurking just beneath the surface, returned with a vengeance. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the desperate need for his solid, reassuring presence. She moved to his side and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his damp shirt. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. The storm raged outside, a wild and indifferent force, in the flickering firelight of the ruined building. She tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes wide and dark with fear of the coming day. "Silas," she begged, her voice a fragile whisper against the howl of the wind. "Hold me tight before the dawn." He tightened his grip, his embrace the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart. He held her, his own ghosts momentarily silenced by her need. But even as he held her, a sense of profound unease settled over him. Something was wrong. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. It was an old soldier's instinct, a feeling of being watched that had kept him alive on more than one occasion. He slowly lifted his gaze from her hair and scanned the broken-out window on the far side of the room. The storm swirled outside, a maelstrom of wind and sleet, but for a fraction of a second, between gusts of wind, he saw it, a shape, a dark figure, standing motionless in the relative shelter of a thicket of pine trees just beyond the clearing. A man, watching them. The hunter had found their trail. They were not alone. The soldier's instinct did not lie. Silas felt the watcher's presence like a drop of ice on his skin, a subtle shift in the fabric of the storm-tossed night. He did not turn his head or give any outward sign of alarm. He simply tightened his hold on Annabeth, his body a shield, his mind racing, calculating angles and exits. The man in the trees was patient, a professional. This was not a chance encounter. This was a hunt. "Annabeth?" he whispered, his voice a low vibration against her ear, calm and steady, betraying none of the frantic urgency pounding in his chest. "When I tell you to, I want you to walk slowly to the horses. Saddle them as quietly as you can. Do you understand?" She pulled back, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear, born not of the storm, but of the sudden, lethal stillness in him. She had seen this man tired, grief-stricken, and tender. Now she saw the soldier he had been, a man honed to a razor's edge by a world of violence. She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. "Now," he said. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion, turning to face the fire, deliberately placing his body between the broken window and Annabeth. He poked at the flames, a casual, disarming gesture that gave her the cover she needed. Behind him, she moved with a silent, practiced grace, her fear a cold fuel in her veins, the soft thud of blankets being placed on the horses' backs, the faint squeak of a cinch being tightened. Every sound was a thunderclap in the tense silence. The man in the trees was greedy. He had tracked them for days, waiting for the right moment. The storm and the shelter were a gift. He figured to wait until they were asleep, to take them without a fight. The $500 for the woman, and maybe another 100 for the man who was with her. It was a good purse. His name was Harlan, and he had been sent by Elias Thorne with a simple instruction: bring her back and make sure the man with her never bothered anyone again. He had a partner, Cole, circling around to the back of the way station. They would have them caught in a pincer. Silas heard the faint scrape of a boot on stone from the rear of the building. They were not alone. There were at least 2 of them. He walked calmly to where he had leaned his rifle against the wall, picking it up as if to clean it. Annabeth was by the horses now, their reins in her hand. "Get on," he said, his voice still low, but now stripped of all warmth. "Ride for the mouth of the canyon we passed. Do not stop. Do not look back. Go!" "Not without you," she hissed, her voice fierce with terror and loyalty. "Go!" he roared, the command cracking like a whip. For the first time, he used the voice of a man who expected to be obeyed without question, the voice of command from a battlefield long past. The blast of a shotgun tore through the night, splintering the rotting wood of the doorframe where Silas had been standing a second before. He had already dropped to the floor, rolling behind a crumbling section of the stone hearth. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder and fired a single, calculated shot into the darkness toward the muzzle flash. A cry of pain and surprise answered him. Annabeth did not need to be told again. She scrambled onto the mare's back. Grabbing Gideon's reins, she dug her heels in, and the horses plunged out of the relative shelter of the way station into the howling, sleet-filled night. Another shot rang out, this one from the window. Silas returned fire, the rifle bucking against his shoulder. He was buying her time. He fired again, then scrambled to his feet and ran, diving out of the same broken doorway the horses had just passed through. He hit the muddy ground and rolled, coming up in a crouch. He could see the dark shape of the horses disappearing into the narrow entrance of the canyon. Good! A figure rose up from behind a pile of rocks. It was Harlan. He had a rifle to his shoulder. Silas fired first. The man grunted and dropped, but not before squeezing off a round of his own. A white-hot poker of pain seared through Silas's left arm, just above the elbow. The force of it spun him around, and he fell to one knee, the world tilting crazily. He heard the second man, Cole, shouting from the back of the way station. Silas gritted his teeth against the wave of nausea and pain. Clutching his arm, blood, warm and slick, was already soaking his sleeve. He had to move. He staggered to his feet and ran, stumbling and sliding in the mud, chasing the sound of Annabeth's horses into the deep, protective darkness of the canyon. The chase was a nightmare of shadows and echoes. The canyon walls twisted and turned, amplifying the sounds of their frantic flight and the shouts of the men behind them. Annabeth risked a glance over her shoulder and saw Silas, a stumbling, lurching figure, his left arm held tight against his body. She reined in the horses, her heart seizing with terror. "Keep going!" he yelled, his voice strained. But she would not. She slid off the mare, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard, her movements clumsy but determined. The two bounty men came around a bend in the canyon, moving cautiously now. Cole was in the lead, a big, shambling man with a shotgun. Harlan was behind him, clutching a bloody shoulder. "There they are!" Cole shouted, raising his weapon. Silas tried to lift his rifle, but his left arm was useless, a dead weight of agony. He could not steady the barrel. In that moment of helpless rage, a shot rang out, not from his gun, but from beside him. Annabeth stood with her feet planted, the rifle braced against her shoulder just as Silas had taught her. She had not aimed. She had not thought. She had seen the man raising the shotgun to kill Silas, and she had reacted. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the sound of the blast deafening in the narrow space. Cole stopped as if he had run into a wall. A look of profound, almost comical surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest, then back up at Annabeth. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then simply folded in on himself, collapsing to the ground in a heap. The silence that followed was more shocking than the noise. Harlan stared at his dead partner, his face a mask of disbelief, then looked at the woman holding the rifle. The $500 prize had just killed his partner. All the greed drained out of him, replaced by a cold, primal fear. He turned and ran, scrambling back the way he had come, disappearing into the storm. Annabeth stood frozen, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She stared at the still form on the ground, a dark shape in the rain. She had killed a man. The thought had no meaning. It was just a fact, hard and cold and undeniable. A tremor started in her hands and spread through her entire body. "Annabeth!" Silas's voice, tight with pain, cut through her shock. "We have to go, now!" He pulled her toward the horses. She moved like a sleepwalker, allowing him to push her into the saddle. He managed to haul himself onto Gideon, his face pale and slick with rain and sweat. They rode deeper into the canyon, leaving the dead man behind for the storm and the coyotes. They rode until the horses were stumbling with exhaustion, and Silas was swaying dangerously in his saddle. They found what they were looking for as the first miserable light of dawn began to seep into the sky. A cave, a dark slash in the rock face, hidden behind a thick curtain of ancient junipers. Silas practically fell from his horse. He leaned against the rock wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his head lolling against his chest. Annabeth slid to the ground, her own terror momentarily forgotten in the face of his immediate need. She led the horses into the relative dryness of the cave and then turned to him. "Let me see," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She helped him into the cave and eased him to the ground. With fumbling fingers, she used his hunting knife to slice away the sleeve of his coat and shirt. The wound was ugly. The bullet had gone clean through the thick muscle of his upper arm, leaving a ragged exit wound that was bleeding sluggishly. It was not a fatal shot, but in the wilderness, any wound could be. Infection was a death sentence. Her mind raced, desperately trying to recall the things he had taught her, the old battlefield tricks he had mentioned in passing. Clean the wound, stop the bleeding, bind it tight. She took the small flask of whiskey from his saddlebag. "This will hurt," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She poured the raw spirit directly into the wound. Silas cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of agony, his body arching off the cave floor, but he did not fight her. She tore long strips from her own petticoat, the last remnant of her old life, and used them to scrub the wound clean as best she could. She remembered him talking about how soldiers used moss to pack wounds. She ran out into the rain and pulled handfuls of green, spongy moss from the base of the juniper trees, pressing it firmly against the bleeding to staunch the flow. Finally, she bound his arm tightly with more strips of cloth, her knots firm and sure. He faded in and out of consciousness as she worked. His skin was hot to the touch, the fever already setting in. She built a small, smokeless fire deep in the cave, its flickering light a small comfort against the vast, hostile darkness. She sat beside him, shivering in the damp cold, her hand resting on his forehead. The long night stretched into an eternity. She sat vigil in the dark, whispering all the things she had never had the courage to say. She told him about her childhood, about her love for books, about a pony she had once owned. She told him how his quiet strength had been the first thing to make her feel safe since she had run. She told him how his gentleness had taught her that not all men were monsters. "I was so scared," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the darkness, her warm breath misting in the cold air. "I thought I was going to die out there. And then you found me. You were my anchor. Silas, you are the only home I have left." She leaned over him, her hair falling around his face, and confessed the deepest truth of all. "Do not leave me," she begged, tears tracing paths down her dirty cheeks. "Please do not leave me. I love you." He thrashed in the grip of the fever, his body racked with shudders. He began to murmur, his words slurred and disconnected, fragments from a life she did not know. He spoke of Ohio, of a farm, of a man named Caleb. And then his voice grew clear, filled with a terrible, aching tenderness. "Sarah," he breathed, his eyes still closed, a faint, heartbreaking smile on his lips. "I am coming home. Sarah." Annabeth flinched as if he had slapped her. The name was a shard of ice in her heart. Sarah, his dead wife, even here, on the edge of death. It was his wife he called for. A ghost. She was sitting here, pouring out her soul to a man who was dreaming of another woman. The pain of it was a bitter, physical thing. She felt a sudden, sharp urge to pull her hand away, to leave him to his ghosts and his fevered dreams. But she did not. She looked at his face, vulnerable and pale in the firelight, and the anger and hurt dissolved, leaving only a profound, aching sorrow. His past was as much a part of him as the scar on his temple or the calluses on his hands. She could not love the man without loving his wounds, too. She squeezed his hand tighter, her knuckles white. She would not leave his side. She would anchor him to this world, even if his heart belonged to another. At dawn, the storm had passed. A pale, watery light filtered into the mouth of the cave. The fever had broken. Silas's skin was cool and damp to the touch. his breathing deep and even. He opened his eyes. They were clear, the fever gone. He looked around the cave, his gaze slowly coming into focus. Then he looked at her. She was asleep, her head resting on her knees, her body slumped with exhaustion, but her hand was still firmly holding his. He looked at her face, smudged with dirt and tears, and saw the fierce, stubborn loyalty that had kept him alive through the night. He did not know what she had whispered in the dark. He did not know the pain his own fevered words had caused her. He only knew that she was still there. They limped into the small, nameless village 2 days later. It was less a town and more a collection of ramshackle huts and sod houses huddled in a forgotten valley. A place that would not appear on any map. It was a village of outcasts. Annabeth saw it in the faces of the people who emerged cautiously from their homes to watch them approach. She saw the weary, watchful eyes of runaway slaves, the haunted expressions of war deserters, the quiet, resilient grief of widows and orphans. These were the people who had fallen through the cracks of the world, people who had been chewed up and spat out by society. They were people who understood suffering. An older black woman with skin like wrinkled leather and eyes that held a universe of wisdom stepped forward. She introduced herself as Esther. She looked at Annabeth's exhausted face, at Silas's bandaged arm, and the rifle he still held loosely in his good hand. And she nodded slowly, a deep and knowing understanding in her gaze. "You look like you have run a long way." "Children," she said, her voice a low, melodic hum. "You can rest here. No one will bother you. We all have our ghosts in this place." They gave them a small, clean sod house to rest in. They brought them food, a hearty stew and fresh water, and clean bandages for Silas's arm. For the first time since they had fled the cabin, they experienced a moment of peace. They were among people who did not ask questions, who did not judge. Their shared status as fugitives was a silent, unbreakable bond. The peace lasted for 3 days. On the 4th day, a traveling merchant passed through the village, bringing with him supplies and news from the outside world. He brought a new handbill from the territorial capital. Elias Thorne had escalated his war. He had filed official charges with the law. Annabeth was no longer just a runaway wife. She was an accused criminal. The charges were for theft of a horse and property, slander against her husband's good name, and immoral conduct. A territorial marshal, a lawman, was now officially on their trail. That night, Silas sat with Annabeth in the quiet of their borrowed home. His arm was healing, but his face was grim. The law was a different enemy than a bounty hunter. It was relentless, implacable. "They are not just hunting you anymore, Annabeth," he said, his voice heavy. "They are hunting us. The charges name me as your accomplice. I am the one they will hang." He paused, and the next words were the hardest he had ever had to say. "We have to split up. If I lead them off on my own, you might have a chance to disappear. It is the only way to protect you." Annabeth looked at him, at the terrible, misguided nobility in his eyes. He was trying to do what he had always done, take the world's burdens onto his own shoulders, sacrifice himself to atone for sins that were not his. She saw the frightened girl she had been, the one who would have cowered at his words, who would have agreed out of fear. But that girl was gone. She had been burned away in the firefight in the canyon and reforged in the long, dark night in the cave. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. It was the sound of a rock breaking a wave. He stared at her. "Annabeth, you do not understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her voice clear and strong. "You think leaving me is protecting me? You are wrong. The only time I have ever been truly in danger is when I have been alone. I am not that girl anymore. Silas, I am not someone who runs and hides." She stood up and faced him, her small frame radiating a strength that had been forged in fire and fear. "I will not leave you. I will not run. Whatever is coming for us, we face it together." Her refusal was a quiet declaration of war against the world that had tried to break them. It hung in the small sod house, a shield against Silas's well-intentioned despair. They would face what was coming, together. They did not have to wait long. The lawman arrived a week later, not with a posse and a thunder of hooves, but alone, a solitary rider on a tired gray horse. He was an older man, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. He wore a dusty coat and a battered hat, but the silver star pinned to his vest was unmistakable, glinting dully in the midday sun. He did not ride directly to their dwelling. Instead, he dismounted in the center of the small, dusty clearing that served as the village's main square, tethering his horse to a hitching post that looked as weary as he did. And then he simply stood there, his presence a quiet, unmovable fact. Word spread through the village not with shouts, but with a sudden, charged silence. Doors closed. The sound of a blacksmith's hammer ceased. Children were called inside. Then, one by one, the outcasts emerged from their homes. Esther was the first, her back straight, her face a mask of serene defiance. She was joined by a one-armed man who had deserted from the Union Army, two sisters who had escaped an indenture, a quiet family of freed slaves, and others, their faces a tapestry of hardship and survival. They did not speak, they did not brandish weapons. They simply formed a loose, silent circle around the lawman, their bodies a living, breathing wall. They were a community of ghosts, and they protected their own from inside their small house. Silas and Annabeth watched. Silas's hand rested on the stock of the Winchester, his knuckles white. Every instinct in him screamed to fight, to run, to do anything but wait for the trap to spring. But Annabeth placed a hand on his arm, her touch steadying him. "No more running," she said, her voice low but clear. "Let me—" Before he could protest, she walked to the door and opened it. She stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, her head held high. She did not look like a cowering fugitive or a fallen woman. She looked like the daughter of a proud rancher, a woman of substance, a woman who had a story to tell and demanded to be heard. She walked directly toward the lawman, the silent villagers parting to let her pass. The lawman, whose name was Marshal John Harding, watched her approach. His eyes, the color of faded denim, were tired, but they were not unkind. He had been a lawman for 30 years, and he had seen every kind of trouble the territories could produce. He had seen greed and cruelty, and he had seen the desperate acts of people pushed to the edge. He was a man who understood the vast, gray country that existed between what was legal and what was right. "Marshal," Annabeth said, her voice clear and strong, carrying in the silence. She stopped a few feet from him. "I am Annabeth Whitmore. I believe you are looking for me." Harding's gaze flickered for a moment to the silent, unmoving villagers, then returned to her. "The handbill says your name is Annabeth Thorne," he stated, his voice a dry, dusty rasp. "And it says you are wanted for theft and other charges." "The handbill was written by a man who bought me, Marshal," Annabeth said, her voice unwavering. "And the law you represent was written by men like him, but I will tell you the truth, if you have the patience to hear it." And so she did, standing there in the dust under the hot Wyoming sun, with a silent jury of outcasts bearing witness. She told him everything. She did not cry or plead. She spoke in a calm, factual voice that gave her words a terrible, undeniable weight. She spoke of her father's ruin and the shame that had driven him to sell her like livestock. She spoke of Elias Thorne, of his cold, possessive eyes and the casual cruelty of his touch. She spoke of the wedding night, describing the fear and the violence not with hysterics, but with a chilling, detailed clarity. "He tore my mother's wedding dress from my body. Marshal," she said, her eyes locked on his. "He told me that my duty was to submit, that a wife's body was her husband's property. Is that the law you have come here to enforce?" She told him of her escape, barefoot into the freezing night, of running until she could not feel her own feet. She told him of collapsing in a ditch, ready to die, and then she told him of Silas. "The man you have named as my accomplice found me half dead. He did not ask for my story. He did not ask for my name. He saw a human being in need of help, and he gave it. He cleaned my wounds. He fed me from his own meager supplies. He gave me his bed while he slept in a chair. He protected me. Marshall, not just from the winter, but from the memory of what had been done to me. He gave me back my life." She gestured to the silent villagers around them. "These people gave us shelter. They asked for nothing in return. This is the only true sanctuary I have ever known. Now, you have come to drag me back to the man who abused me, and to hang the man who saved me. Tell me, Marshall, in all your years, is that what you call justice?" The silence that followed was profound. The wind kicked up a small dust devil that danced across the square, and then died. Marshall Harding stood for a long time, his gaze on the distant, hazy line of the mountains. He had heard 1,000 stories in his career, 1,000 lies and excuses. But this was not one of them. He could hear the ringing clarity of truth in the woman's voice. He looked at her, at the fierce, unbroken spirit in her eyes, and then at the hard, weary faces of the people who stood with her. He saw not a den of criminals, but a congregation of the wounded, a tribe of survivors. He finally let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of hard justice. "The law is a clumsy instrument. Miss," he said, his voice softer now, "it is written in black and white, but the world is all shades of gray." He looked her straight in the eye. "I cannot ignore a warrant. I cannot make the bounty disappear. Elias Thorne has money and influence, and he will send other men who are not as patient as I am, men who do not care about the truth." He paused, and a flicker of something, pity or perhaps respect, crossed his face. "But this is a big country. A man can get lost out here. A trail can go cold. Reports can get delayed." He walked to his horse and untied the reins. "I will report that I found your trail near the Snake River, but that it was washed out by a flash flood. It will take them weeks, maybe months, to sort it out and send someone else. That is the best I can do for you." He swung himself up into the saddle, a tired, aching movement. He looked down at Annabeth, and then at the ring of silent villagers. "You have good people here," he said. He tipped the brim of his hat, a gesture of salute. "I hope you find your peace." And with that, he turned his horse and rode away, not back the way he had come, but south toward a different horizon. He did not look back. The village seemed to exhale as one. The law had come, and the law had gone, defeated not by guns, but by the simple, powerful truth of a woman who refused to be a victim. In the weeks that followed, as Silas's arm healed and the deep lines of exhaustion began to fade from their faces, a new kind of peace settled over them. The immediate threat was gone, replaced by a low, persistent awareness that they were still fugitives. But the marshal's gift of time was a precious one, a space to breathe, to think, to heal. Silas began to help the one-armed deserter, whose name was Samuel, reinforce the village's small corral. Annabeth spent her days with Esther, learning the properties of wild herbs and helping tend to the community's shared garden. They were a part of something, woven into the fabric of this strange, resilient family. One evening, Silas came to Annabeth as she sat on a small stool outside their sod house, watching the last of the sun's fire die on the western peaks. His arm was out of its sling, a long, clean scar the only reminder of the chase. He stood before her, his face serious, the old, familiar guilt still lurking in the depths of his eyes. "Annabeth," he began, his voice quiet, "the marshal gave us a chance for you." She looked up at him, her heart tensing. She knew what was coming. "You do not have to live this life," he continued, the words costing him more than she could know. Always looking over your shoulder, always one step ahead of the next man Thorne sends. There are people here who could help you. Esther has family in St. Louis. They could get you a ticket on a train, back east. You could change your name, start over, live a normal life, a safe life. He was offering her an escape, not just from Thorne, but from him, from the hard, uncertain life of a fugitive's companion. He was giving her a choice, the one thing no one else ever had. It was the most selfless, most loving, and most painful thing he had ever done. He was trying to save her from himself, from the ruin he still believed he carried with him like a plague. She looked at his earnest, tormented face, at the man who saw himself as a curse but who had been her only blessing. She thought of the life he was describing, a safe, normal life in a city, a world of paved streets and polite society, a world without him. The thought was not of safety, but of a desolate, unbearable emptiness. She stood up and closed the small space between them. She reached up and placed her hands on either side of his bearded face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I have had a taste of that life. Silas," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "I was safe in my father's house, and he sold me. I was safe in my husband's house, and he beat me. The only place I have ever truly felt safe is in your arms." His face crumpled, the years of pain and guilt and loneliness finally giving way. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with the release of a burden he had carried for too long. He held her not like a man protecting a fragile charge, but like a man clinging to his own salvation. They did not go east. They did not go west. They stayed, on the edge of the valley, just a short walk from the village of outcasts. They found a plot of land near a clear running creek, sheltered by a stand of cottonwood trees, and together, they began to build a home. It was not easy. They built it with their own hands, felling trees and hewing logs, mixing mud and sod for the walls. The winters still bit with a terrible, merciless cold. The whispers of society still reached them on the rare occasions they dealt with traveling merchants. They were the runaway bride and the broken soldier, a story for gossips to chew on. But inside the sturdy walls of their small cabin, they were just Annabeth and Silas. They survived. They had the quiet friendship of the villagers, the shared meals, the helping hands during harvest and hardship. Their life was not loud or easy, but it was real. It was theirs. Years passed, flowing by like the creek that ran past their door. The seasons turned, each one leaving them a little stronger, a little more rooted in this wild, forgotten place. The lines on their faces deepened, but they were lines of laughter and sun now, not just sorrow and fear. Their hands were calloused, their bodies hardened by work, but their hearts were soft toward each other. The ghosts of their pasts still visited in the quiet hours of the night, but they were no longer menacing specters. They were just sad, faded memories, their power diminished by the steady, living warmth of the person sleeping beside them. One night, a new sound echoed in the small cabin, piercing the deep silence of the wilderness. It was a thin, reedy cry, a sound of fierce, demanding life, the cry of a baby. Several months later, on a quiet morning just before the sun broke over the eastern mountains, Annabeth lay awake in their bed. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers, casting a soft, warm light on the rough-hewn log walls. Silas slept beside her, his breathing deep and even, one arm thrown protectively across her and the small, sleeping bundle nestled between them. The world was still and quiet, holding its breath for the coming day. She looked at the man beside her, at the peaceful, unguarded expression on his face, a look she had painstakingly helped him find. She looked at their son, a miracle of new life, a testament to their stubborn refusal to be broken. Her heart was so full of a quiet, profound gratitude it felt like it might burst. The fear of the dawn was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. She leaned into Silas, her lips close to his ear, and whispered the words that had become their prayer, their promise, their love story. "Hold me tight before dawn." And he did. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from, so we can all connect. Please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.